This is the village of Chaddesley Corbett, one of the more photographed villages in Worcestershire. Many of the houses aren't as old as they might appear, but have been rebuilt from time to time. And so we see an amalgam of 16th century, 17th century, 18th and 19th century architecture on plots that are little changed in 300 years, as this map of 1697 demonstrates. In this Golden Jubilee year, 2002, let's look back and see what we can learn from the photographs of the last 100 years. Just look at this blossoming chestnut tree, which marks the gateway to the village. It was planted over 100 years ago in commemoration of the Silver Jubilee of Queen Victoria. And this is the son of the man who performed the ceremony, Dr. Fitch. Both doctors, father and son, contributed much to village life in the early part of the 20th century. The church is, of course, the major building in the village. Outwardly, it's changed little in the last 100 years. The Lich Gate is the most modern addition, built in 1889. It's seen here in around 1916, with some members of the Perrins family who lived in Yew Tree Cottage. The stocks had been taken away by this time. As with the attractive Lichgate house next door, it has not been altered. After the church, the next most imposing building is Lodge Farm, here seen when it was still a farm. And here a 20th century restoration of this 16th century building. And now the finished product, 2002. In the village street there were only a few shops, though we would find others in Bluntington, Woodrow, Dorrell, Harvington and elsewhere in the parish which no longer exist. Barton's on the right with its bay window was a general store almost continuously up to the 1970s. In one of our oldest pictures we see the Hemming family in the street outside the shop. On the opposite side of the street is Saddler's Cottage, shown here in the 1920s. One of the signs says post office, the other public telephone. Miss Bow ran the post office from here. Here is the same building a few years earlier. As the sign tells us, Mr. Stone was running a saddlery business from it. The connection is retained in the modern name. Further up the street we find the Swan Hotel, seen here in the time of Alfred Payne, the licensee from 1905 to 1911. From then until 1943, Timothy Hill presided behind the bar, and this shot shows his name clearly on the sign. In summertime he used to make his own cider, encouraging the local children to taste the brew, sometimes with disastrous results. He used to organise charabanc outings for customers and friends. The Swan was used a lot for large village functions, probably in the large room which is much younger than the main 17th century building. The name Swan is first mentioned in 1728, but the building has been used as a pub for much longer than that. Let's look again now at this photograph taken in the 1920s or 30s. On the right-hand side of the street is another shop, one which has been a butcher's for many a year. The names of William Bryan and Joe Serrell may ring a bell. Mr. Serrell's young delivery boy is seen here in the doorway. Perhaps you might recognise him. Dennis Banks, Joe Serrell's successor, carries on the business, but the abattoir that was once behind the shop no longer exists. Which leads us back up the street to Jukes. Samuel Jukes bought the business in 1933 from Thomas Watmore. Here is Samuel, and in the delivery cart his wife Eva and daughter Jessie. Jessie, Joanna Powick's mother, appears again in this photograph in the 1930s. Note the name Watmore on the handcart. Well, the names may have changed and the sign may have disappeared, but the shop is still known as Jukes and it's still in the family. Here's Richard Vale, the new proprietor, a month or two ago. Broughton cottages are probably among the oldest buildings in the street. The close studding seen here indicates late 15th or early 16th century work. It's been a shop now for several years, but was formerly two cottages, named after a 17th century vicar of the parish. See now its neighbour on the other side of Fisher's Lane. It is still called the Malt House, and was indeed once used for that purpose, but many other activities have been pursued here. The picture could be that of Mr. Fitchett, who described himself as a grocer and horsebreaker. The date is probably early 1900s. Subsequently, it was a newspaper shop in the 1920s under Mr. and Mrs. Perrins. Then a cycle repair shop under Mr. Sawyer, a sub-branch of the Midland Bank too, before that moved to Yew Tree Cottage on the other side of the street. Mr. Foyle, of bookshop fame, leased it to the Youth Hostel Association. And here we see first Mrs. Hodges and her daughter outside what's now the Georgian House, but which was then part of the Youth Hostel, and her husband, Mr. Hodges, who was the warden from 1942 to 1947. Mr. Hodges was at the same time a gardener at Brockencote Hall. Nowadays it's a clothes shop, and the Georgian House is a separate residence. At one time the village boasted 2 shoemakers. One of them was Crutchy Raybold, so called because he'd lost a leg and used a crutch, practised his craft from a room in what's now Lodge Cottage. The one remaining business we haven't mentioned is perhaps the best known. Many outsiders will recognise this public house more easily than the Swan. Though both have been active in the trade for centuries, and both, let it be said, do offer very drinkable beers. The photographs show the changes to the front elevation, but not the buildings behind that have since been knocked down to make a car park. The right-hand side, formerly known as Steps House, was up to about 30 years ago 2 private residences. Here we see Harry Day, Nora Hemming and Bill Birch. Church View cottages next door have remained more or less unaltered, formerly owned by the brewery and offering much-needed rental accommodation. The village used to have a resident vicar. This building, built in 1854, was the vicarage until 1960. Rising maintenance costs forced the diocese to make the parish agree to a new vicarage seen here on Briar Hill, but this in turn was occupied by only 3 vicars up to 1983. Since that date, the Reverend John Cox, who has the charge of the 2 parishes of Chaddesley Corbett and Stone, lives in the vicarage at Stone. So we lost our resident vicar. We also lost our resident schoolmaster when the school house was sold by the Educational Trust, as teachers preferred to own their own accommodation rather than to rent from their employers. However, we didn't lose our village school, though at one time it was touch and go as to whether we would. The origins of the village school go back way beyond 1809, when this building was built. In this sketch, made sometime before 1870, it doesn't look a very welcoming place. Since then, it's been restored in 1965, and again later, rather more sympathetically, being adapted for use with the more modern school built in 1894. This too was subsequently extended to provide more classrooms. On the other side of the road stands the purpose-built Infants and Girls School, built in 1848, a splendid example of Victorian architecture. After the girls' school was combined with the boys', the building served several purposes and is now residential flats. And in 1976 we lost our resident doctor. Tudor House, seen here, has been the home of the village doctor since the late 18th century. The hayloft next door was built by Dr. Fitch as a coach house and subsequently served as the doctor's surgery. In place of the present splendid walnut tree, there used to be a couple of timbered cottages, demolished in the early 1900s. But, fortunate village that we are, we now have this purpose-built surgery, which offers a wide range of modern facilities. And last but not least, we lost our resident policeman. The police station, featured here, contained a small lock-up, just in case. But what of the brick and timber cottages that are so much a feature of the modern village? By the late 1950s, many of them had fallen into disrepair. Some people on the then Kidderminster Rural District Council would have had them pulled down and replaced. But thanks largely to this man, Sam Spencer, it didn't happen. He argued for restoration rather than demolition, either by the council, as in the old workhouse, on the left, now Harkaway House, and in Batch cottages. A view of the rear and of the cottages behind. Or by private owners, as in Beam's End, seen here in the early 60s. Two views of the rear. As you can see, the task of restoration was considerable. And as in Lodge Cottage in 1963. There was no running water, only the pump at the back. And no sanitation, bar in this case a little lean-to on the left, and the night soil cart to take it away. Quarry tiles laid on Mother Earth provided a floor. The pigsty was at the bottom of the garden. Now fully restored, with all modern conveniences. Yew Tree Cottage between the wars. Sadler's Cottage in the 1950s. And Elizabeth Cottage. Living conditions in the interwar years in such buildings were hard, and for many years the parish council was pressing for modern council accommodation. These 6 semi-detached houses were the first to be built in 1928. They were followed over a period of some 30 years by the Crescent, Malvern View, and the Green. Hemingway, behind the main street, was built in the 1960s around the older Field Cottage in response to the same economic and social pressures. Partly by private development and partly by the council, especially for younger residents of the parish, and, as in this picture, for the elderly. So as we look back at the changes in our village over the last 100 years, we're left wondering what the next 100 will bring. How many of the buildings we know so well will survive? And what sort of life will the inhabitants of the future be leading?